How one engineer saved the Allies from the Wolfpack menace. March 17th, 1942, North Atlantic, midnight. A convoy of merchant ships crawled through the black, heaving ocean. Their engines throbbed under the icy wind, exhaust plumes vanishing into fog so thick it felt alive. Somewhere out there, unseen, unheard, German U-boats waited. The men aboard knew it. They always did. In the radio shack of HMS Viscount, a young operator leaned over his equipment, eyes red from sleepless nights. Every few seconds, he adjusted the dials, searching for the faintest ping. Nothing. Just static. Cold, endless static. Then, suddenly, a flash on the horizon, an explosion. The SS Empire cloud vanished in a bloom of flame. Within seconds, the convoy erupted in chaos, ships veering, horns blaring, Morse chatter filling the air. Another torpedo struck, then another. It was the work of a Wolfpack. Coordinated groups of German submarines, using encrypted radio signals and deadly patience, hunted these convoys like predators in the dark. The Allies called it the Battle of the Atlantic, but for the sailors trapped out here, it felt more like a slaughter. In London, the situation was desperate. Churchill called the U-boat threat the only thing that ever really frightened me. Thousands of tons of supplies, food, munitions, medicine, were being swallowed by the sea each week. Britain's lifeline was shrinking, and the worst part? The enemy was invisible. Traditional radar failed over water. Radio waves scattered off the waves and vanished into the fog. The Atlantic had become a blindfolded battlefield. But in a dim laboratory far from the front lines, one quiet engineer believed he could change that. His name was Alan Blunt, a radar scientist with the Royal Air Force's Telecommunications Research Establishment. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even supposed to be famous. But his idea, a single, elegant breakthrough, would one day make the U-boat hunters see in the dark. That night, as convoys burned under the Atlantic fog, Alan was staring at a cathode ray tube, chasing ghosts of his own. He noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic echo, bouncing back not from the sea, but from beyond it. It was weak, fragmented, but real. And if it was real, it meant one thing. Radar could see through fog, maybe even farther. Alan leaned forward, heart pounding. He scribbled notes furiously, unaware that, at that very moment, he'd just glimpsed the solution that would turn the tide of the war. The spark in the lab. It was dawn when Alan Blunt finally stepped outside. The air over Malvern Hills was sharp and silent, the kind that cut through your lungs and cleared your head. Below him, the radar lab, a tangle of cables, antennae, and chalkboard equations, buzzed to life again. Inside, the team of engineers were already at their posts, coffee in tin mugs, eyes ringed with fatigue. They'd been told a dozen times by Air Ministry officials that radar couldn't work reliably over the Atlantic. Too much interference, too much fog, too much of everything. But Alan wasn't convinced. He'd spent months analyzing why radar echoes faded at sea, and what he'd found was almost heretical. The problem wasn't the radar's power, it was the frequency. High-frequency signals scattered too easily over the waves, but a shorter, more concentrated wavelength, in the microwave range, could cut through moisture, fog, even low clouds. It could paint a target where none had been seen before. He called it centimetric radar. The others thought it was madness. Britain's existing systems, the massive chain-home radars that ringed the coast, worked on long wavelengths, reliable but crude. They could detect bombers coming from France, not periscopes on a heaving ocean. Blunt's design was different. It used a cavity magnetron, a compact device that could produce microwaves thousands of times more powerful than anything before it. If it worked, aircraft and ships could finally spot submarines before they struck. There was just one problem. Nobody had ever made it stable enough for combat. The lab echoed with the hum of machinery as Alan and his assistant, Margaret Ellis, adjusted the magnetron's alignment. Sparks hissed. The oscilloscope flickered. For a moment the line went flat. Then, a pulse. A clean, perfect pulse. Alan smiled. Not triumph, relief. "We've got it," he whispered. Margaret looked up. "You mean?" "Yes," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the glowing trace. "Now we can see them." Outside, a message was being drafted for the Admiralty. New radar shows promising detection in fog. Recommend immediate field test. Within weeks, a prototype was fitted onto a short Sunderland patrol aircraft, one of the flying boats that roamed the Atlantic hunting U-boats. The test mission was set for early April. Alan insisted on being there, not as a scientist, but as an observer. He knew that if his invention failed, men would die believing radar could save them. And if it succeeded, the hunters of the deep were about to become the hunted. The first hunt, April 3rd, 1942. RAF Coastal Command, Pembroke Dock, Wales. Rain lashed the airfield as dawn broke, a smear of grey over grey. The short Sunderland flying boat, its hull streaked with salt and grime, groaned under the wind. Crewmen moved quickly, checking guns, fuel lines. The brand new radar unit bolted under its nose like a secret weapon. Alan Blunt stood at the edge of the tarmac, collar pulled high against the cold. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't even supposed to be here. But when you've built a device that could alter the course of the war, you don't stay in the lab to hope it works. You go see it prove itself. "Ready to make history, sir," one of the ground crew shouted over the engines. Blunt only nodded. His stomach turned with nerves. If this radar failed, the U-boats would remain untouchable phantoms beneath the waves. The Sunderland lifted off, engines roaring as it clawed into the mist. Inside, the crew strapped in, the radio crackling faintly with convoy chatter. Alan sat beside the radar operator, Sergeant Tim Havers, who adjusted the glowing green screen before them. At first, nothing. Just static hum and the sweeping rhythm of the trace. The Atlantic stretched below, an endless plain of clouded water, moving, shifting, alive. Hours passed. Then faintly, a blip. Small, fading in and out. "Could be a whale," Havers muttered. "Hold course," Alan said quietly. He leaned closer, eyes locked on the scope. The pulse reappeared, stronger this time. Regular, metallic, not a whale. A shape broke the surface below. A conning tower slicing through the grey sea. The periscope glinted for just a second before vanishing again. "U-boat spotted," the pilot shouted. "Bearing 227. The Sunderland banked hard. Depth charges rolled from the bay doors, tumbling into the water. Seconds later, boom. Columns of spray shot skyward. Then another explosion ripped the surface. Oil bubbled up. Debris. Silence. The crew cheered, but Alan didn't. He stared at the scope, stunned. The radar had seen the submarine before any human eye. It worked. He'd done it. When they landed, news traveled fast through Coastal Command. The new radar had tracked a submerged U-boat through fog and rain, a feat once thought impossible. Commanders swarmed the aircraft, eager to see the device touch the future. Within weeks, radar sets were ordered for every patrol aircraft in the Atlantic. What had begun as one man's stubborn experiment was about to become the Allies' deadliest secret. But the Germans wouldn't take it lying down. They too had their scientists. And they would soon realize that something, or someone, had turned the tide against them. The Wolfpack strikes back. June 1942. mid-Atlantic. Night swallowed the convoy again. 60 merchant ships ploughed through the storm, each one carrying enough cargo to feed a city, if they survived. The men on deck barely spoke anymore. Every splash, every flicker of light on the horizon could mean death. Far below the surface, Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, commander of U-99 and one of Germany's most feared submarine aces, peered through his periscope. He'd sunk over 40 ships in these very waters, but tonight felt different. The fog was thicker, the air is heavier. He gave the order. "Torpedo! Loss!" A dull thump, a streak of white bubbles. Moments later, a flash. The SS Clearwater erupted in flame, the sky glowing orange against the rain. Kretschmer smiled grimly. Another one for the Reich. But then, something strange. A low hum in the distance. It wasn't thunder. It was engines. Aircraft engines. Before he could dive, a blinding searchlight split the darkness. A Sunderland flying boat roared overhead, its radar having caught the U-boat's periscope moments earlier. Flares lit the waves in eerie daylight. "Crash dive!" Kretschmer yelled. But it was too late. The first depth charge exploded meters away. The boat rocked violently, dials shattered, water pouring through the hull. In London, Alan Blunt watched the after-action report come in. U-99 destroyed by air patrol. Radar sighting confirmed before visual detection. It was the third U-boat sunk that week. The tables had turned. The wolfpacks, once invisible predators, were being picked off one by one. Their commanders began to fear the soundless hum of aircraft engines at night. They called it the radar curse. By autumn, Allied losses dropped sharply. Convoys reached Britain with supplies intact. Bread returned to tables, and shipyards worked without fear of starvation. But victory came at a cost. Every new radar installation had to be tested, calibrated, and protected. The Germans soon realized their boats were being hunted in ways they couldn't explain. Intelligence officers in Berlin whispered of a new British magic. They began developing countermeasures. Radar detectors they called METOX. It was crude, but dangerous. If the U-boats could sense the radar waves, they could evade the hunters again. When word reached Alan's lab, the celebration turned to dread. They had unlocked the enemy's secret. But the enemy was learning fast. Alan gathered his team. "They can hear us now," he said. "So we make them deaf." It was the beginning of a new arms race. One fought not with bullets, but with invisible waves. Autumn, 1942, Malvern, England. The laboratory was alive again, cables tangled like vines, the hum of oscillators mixing with the clack of typewriters. On the far table, Alan Blunt stood over a schematic, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. His team crowded around as he spoke, voice low but urgent. "The Germans have METOX detectors. They can hear our radar pulses before we see them," he said, drawing a sharp X across the chart. "That means our planes are shouting into the dark. We need to whisper." The challenge was enormous. To outsmart METOX, they had to redesign the radar's frequency. Not just shorter waves this time, but smarter ones. Signals that slipped through detection like ghosts through fog. Margaret Ellis leaned in, tapping the blueprint. "If we vary the pulse, slightly irregular, never repeating, their receivers won't lock on." Alan nodded. "Exactly. Randomize the heartbeat." They called the new system H2S, the world's first ground mapping radar, but its secret upgrade, codenamed Fish Pond, was what terrified the U-boats. It could scan the sea beneath aircraft and display submarines as glowing dots, invisible to the naked eye, but alive on screen. Testing began immediately. Every night, crews flew over the Bristol Channel, experimenting with frequencies, while Alan monitored from a control van, pencil trembling between his fingers. Each pulse was a duel against an enemy he couldn't see. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German scientists were frantic. Their once mighty Kriegsmarine was bleeding. Submarine bases at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire filled with wrecks. Boats limping home, crushed by the unseen reach of radar-guided bombers. Admiral Dönitz demanded answers. How do they find us in fog, in darkness, beneath the clouds? A technician muttered the word that chilled everyone in the room. Microvelen. Microwaves. The British had leaped forward by years. By spring 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. For every Allied ship sunk, 2 U-boats disappeared beneath the waves. Convoy escorts now hunted aggressively, sweeping the seas with radar beams that pierced night and storm alike. But Alan hardly celebrated. The more effective his invention became, the more it haunted him. Each blip on a screen meant men drowning in freezing water. Young sailors trapped inside steel coffins. He knew it was war. He knew it was necessary. But every victory felt heavier. One evening, after another report of multiple U-boats destroyed, Alan stayed behind in the lab. The room was dark except for the radar's circular glow. He watched the trace sweep round and round, the faint echoes fading into nothingness. War by light, he murmured. And they never even saw it coming. He didn't know it yet, but his invention had done more than save ships. It had shifted the balance of the entire war, and made the Allies masters of both sea and sky. Yet one more revelation was still to come. One that would connect his radar to an even larger secret project, hidden deep in the English countryside. The Turning Tide, May 1943, Bletchley Park, England. Rain drummed softly on the manor's leaded windows as Alan Blunt stepped through the heavy oak doors. He wasn't alone. Waiting for him in the drawing room was a man he'd never met, calm, pale, and brilliant-eyed. Alan Turing. "Mr. Blunt," Turing said, extending a hand, "I've heard your radar can see what men cannot. We're doing something similar here, only with messages." Blunt glanced around at the tangle of teleprinters and cipher machines. "You're decoding the U-boat signals." Turing smiled faintly. "Trying to. When you make them visible, we make them readable." It was then Blunt realized. Radar and code breaking were 2 halves of the same weapon. One found the enemy, the other listened to him. Together, they could crush the Wolfpacks completely. Within weeks, the 2 projects quietly linked. Every time Blunt's radar detected a convoy shadow, Bletchley's decoders tracked the radio chatter between U-boats. The Allies began to anticipate attacks before they happened, routing ships safely through gaps in the invisible net. The hunters had become the hunted. By summer, Allied aircraft patrolled the Atlantic around the clock. With centimetric radar mounted on bombers, U-boats could no longer surface even at night to recharge batteries. The radar picked them up instantly. Caught between the ocean's depths and the Allied sky, the German submarine force began to collapse. One night, after a long shift, Alan watched an incoming report. Convoy HX-239. All ships accounted for. No losses. It was the first time that had happened in months. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. That convoy carried enough fuel and food to sustain Britain through another winter. In Berlin, Dönitz sent the message no submariner wanted to hear. All U-boat operations in the North Atlantic suspended. 2 heavy losses. The Wolfpack era was over. But as celebrations broke out across London, Alan Blunt stood quietly by his window, the glow of radar consoles flickering behind him. He knew that technology, his technology, had opened a new kind of warfare, one fought not by sight or sound, but by signals and waves, invisible and unstoppable. He returned to the lab the next morning, just as he always did. No parades, no medals, only the hum of the magnetron, steady and alive. Margaret Ellis walked in, holding a newspaper. The headline read, "U-boat menace defeated, convoys secure." She smiled. "You did it, Alan." He shook his head. "We did. And now the world has to learn what that means." The radar that had saved the Allies from the Wolfpack menace would go on to shape the post-war world, powering air traffic control, weather forecasting, and even the birth of microwave communication. But for Alan Blunt, the quiet engineer who once stared into fog chasing faint echoes, it would always be simpler than that. He hadn't built a weapon, he'd built a way to see, and in doing so, he helped the Allies win the longest, darkest battle of the Second World War, the one fought not in the trenches, but in the stormy silence of the Atlantic. The war would rage on for 2 more brutal years across seas, skies, and shattered cities. But from that moment on, the hunters of the deep were no longer unseen. Alan Blunt's radar, born from quiet obsession and sleepless nights, had given the Allies eyes in the dark and changed the course of history. He never sought fame. He never held command. Yet his inventions saved thousands of lives, proving that victory sometimes belongs not to the generals, but to the minds working silently behind the light. If you've journeyed with us through this hidden chapter of World War II, don't stop here. Subscribe to War Diaries and step into the next untold story, where courage, ingenuity, and fate collide in the fog of war.